Vladimir Putin made an urgent statement and announced that Russia will continue the war and achieve all the goals of the so-called special military operation, regardless of whether a peace deal with Ukraine is reached or not. Today, Vladimir Putin held a meeting with Russian occupiers in the Kremlin and ordered the troops to prepare for the winter campaign and not to slow down the pace of the offensive at the front. Vladimir Putin especially emphasized the capture of Donbas. Meanwhile, Donald Trump has already openly stated that his goal is to bring Russia back into the global economy and even create a new economic alliance with Russia to counter the G7. Meanwhile, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said Russia insists Ukraine remain non-nuclear, neutral, and non-aligned. And he stated that Russia must participate in security guarantees for Ukraine. Otherwise, they will reject the peace plan. And all of this sounds extremely absurd, but at the same time, Financial Times sources have already stated directly that from now on, Russia and the United States are jointly and synchronously demanding that Kyiv withdraw its troops from about a quarter of the Donetsk region and a small part of the neighboring Luhansk region, which are still under Ukraine's control. These are territories that have important political significance for Kyiv and are its most fortified stronghold against a possible full-scale invasion by Moscow in the future. And now Washington is openly pushing Ukraine toward capitulation while Putin is making such bold statements. My name is Alexei Peichi. Let's discuss this topic together, but before we start, I ask you to subscribe to this channel, give it a like, write any detailed comment under this episode, and subscribe to my Telegram channel, Peichi News. The link to it is in the description of this video. There we publish breaking news as it comes in. So, I'll start with a statement from Vladimir Putin. Today, the Russian dictator held a meeting in the Kremlin about the situation in the war against Ukraine. These unwashed, savage Russians still call it a special military operation. The meeting focused on the situation in the north of Donetsk region, and as stated by the Kremlin press secretary Dmytro Peskov, during the discussion Putin noted good dynamics in all directions of the combat zone. The meeting via video link was attended by the chief of the general staff of the Russian Armed Forces, Valery Gerasimov, and the commander of the South Group, Sergei Medvedev. Also present in the president's office in the Kremlin was the commander of the 123rd Motorized Rifle Brigade, Denis Pirogov, Peskov said. And this whole scene was supposed to confirm what Putin had stated the day before. The thing is, the day before, Putin stated that Russia would achieve the goals of the so-called special military operation and bring it to its logical conclusion. Regardless of whether there will be a peace agreement or not, Russia, according to Putin, is trying to end the conflict in Ukraine and, quote, is forced to do so by military means. Well, just forced, you see, as if someone really made you, these unwashed idiots Russians, attack your neighbors as if you're just forced to fight. Well, I really hope that, for those Russian Ivans who are dying in Ukraine, maybe Putin's words about being forced made it a little bit easier for them before they died. And that's it. The new statement by Vladimir Putin came amid ongoing active negotiations mediated by the United States aimed at ending Russia's war against Ukraine. At the same time, the head of the Russian Foreign Ministry, Govoryashchaya Loshad Sergei Lavrov, stated that Ukraine should supposedly be a non-aligned, neutral and non-nuclear state. Because allegedly only on this basis did Russia agree to recognize Ukraine's independence in 1990. Listen. As if back then, at the time of the Soviet Union's collapse, anyone even cared about the opinion of the unwashed. But nevertheless, Lavrov stated that this very idea was the basis of the negotiations between Trump and Putin in Alaska in August. Next, I'll quote Lavrov before Alaska. Stephen Witkoff was in Moscow and brought a proposal that helped form the Anchorage Understanding. The essence of these understandings is that Ukraine must return to non-aligned, neutral and non-nuclear foundations of its statehood. It was these very principles that were enshrined in the Declaration of State Sovereignty of Ukraine on July 16, 1990, and it was precisely on the basis of the principles declared in this document that we recognized Ukraine's independence. Therefore, when they now claim that they can't do anything because their constitution states the goal of joining the North Atlantic Alliance, we recognized a different Ukraine. Here, for the unwashed Russians who for some reason still come to this YouTube channel to watch my videos, I want to emphasize that Ukraine still remains neutral, non-aligned and non-nuclear. So what return and to where is your Lavrov talking about? Just try, at least try. I understand it's very hard for you, but try to use your brain and think a little. Just think a little and try to understand what he's demanding. So, Lavrov, what's the point of all these calls? By the way, let me make a brief digression. Every time I say unwashed Russians, those Russians still come and keep watching my episodes. How little do you have to respect yourself to act like that? But anyway, and you know, unfortunately for us, Trump doesn't even hide his goals in this war anymore. Trump himself. I didn't misspeak. In a Politico interview this week, Donald Trump said Russia now clearly holds a stronger negotiating position than Ukraine on peace talks. Trump noted that he advises Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky to agree to the American peace initiative, which involves significant concessions from Ukraine. Today, the Financial Times reports that Russia and the United States are now jointly demanding Kyiv withdraw its troops from about a quarter of Donetsk and a small part of Luhansk regions. And now even the Financial Times is using wording suggesting that Donbas is supposedly some kind of disputed territory. Quote, in a letter to his Soviet comrades in 1921, Bolshevik revolutionary Lev Trotsky wearily described the Donbas as such a toxic region that, quote, it required a special struggle. The question of Donbas remains just as acute today, as these territories have become one of the most contentious elements of peace negotiations aimed at ending the largest war in Europe since 1945. By seeking to seize these lands through negotiations, the Kremlin is trying to obtain what it has failed to conquer at the cost of enormous military losses since 2014. Control over Donbas would mean capturing the belt of fortress cities Pokrovsk, Konstantinovka, Drushkovka, Kramatorsk, and Slavyansk, which remain a stronghold against Russian forces in eastern Ukraine. Well, let's continue. Financial Times, in accessible language, thanks for that, explains to the Western reader why under no circumstances should Donbas be given to Putin. Quote, some of the fortifications are visible from the highways crossing the region, multi-layered labyrinths of defensive lines made up of barbed wire, trenches, minefields, and other obstacles. The terrain itself also poses a serious barrier to Ukraine's defense, with its natural cliffs and valleys, as well as artificial quarries and slag heaps scattered throughout. However, to the west of this defensive line, the steppe flattens out, and Russia may encounter open fields and less densely populated areas. It would then be easier for Russia to advance deeper into Ukraine if its troops captured the fortress belt cities or acquired them, as the United States proposed in a peace agreement. Well, today the truth has come out. In recent weeks, the United States President's special envoy, Steve Witkoff, has been pressuring Ukrainian negotiators to agree to a land swap, which they consider an inevitable part of any peace agreement between Kyiv and Moscow. This would mean conceding territory in the Donetsk region, which Russia has been trying to seize for more than 10 years. Tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands of servicemen have been involved in countless ground offensives, supported by swarms of kamikaze drones and massive bombardments, but it still hasn't been able to do it. According to White House sources, Stephen Witkoff met with dictator Putin 6 times this year. Today, he is simply obsessed with the idea that if Kyiv just hands over the remaining 25% to Russia of the Donetsk region, which is under his control, then it would be possible to achieve a just peace and avoid a longer and more destructive war. But analysts here warn that a weak agreement will create cracks within Ukraine while leaving nearby regions open to further Russian advances. But the alternative would be to refuse to give up positions and risk Washington withdrawing its support, although it's probably time to admit that the United States is already straining. But Trump insists that the lands Ukraine must hand over to Russia have become internationally recognized territories belonging to the Russian Federation. But supposedly, Russian troops will not enter this demilitarized zone, and that removes the risk of further advances that I mentioned. However, Trump's plan doesn't say a word about what the United States of America will do if the Russians do end up sending their troops into the demilitarized zone. So here Trump is saying, yes, just take the Russians at their word. I'm telling you, Putin wants peace for sure and will behave accordingly. The Ukrainian armed forces here will be in a demilitarized zone, so you don't need to worry about Russians advancing further from this area. Although it has now become known that last month, United States Army Secretary Dan Driscoll was in Kyiv telling Ukrainian officials that the Trump administration is ready to provide guaranteed security for Ukraine as part of a deal by creating what is called the most high-tech demilitarized zone in the world on the Eastern Front line. When Driscoll was asked, when asked how the United States would do this, he couldn't answer and told Ukrainians to trust their allies instead of questioning. He said, "Don't you trust the Americans? We will definitely create the most powerful demilitarized zone in the world." Well, today this question has become clear. So what is being proposed? The United States insists on creating a demilitarized zone similar to the one that separates North and South Korea. Since the signing of that armistice more than 72 years ago. Yes, so on one side there will be Ukrainian soldiers, and on the other side unwashed Russians, but then the conditions for a demilitarized zone without Russians being introduced there fall apart, and it turns into a mess. And here analysts are considering that Ukraine could, in principle, agree to the creation of a demilitarized zone if there were reliable Western security guarantees behind it, including American troops stationed precisely in the very zone that we are being asked to leave in Donbas. But the Americans are so confident in their peace plan that they refuse to send troops there. Without clear guarantees, withdrawing Ukrainian armed forces from Donbas will seem too risky in Ukraine. Therefore, at this point, it can be concluded that the proposed solution does not reflect what is meant by a demilitarized zone, taking into account today's battlefield dynamics, which are dominated by extensive drone strike zones, minefields, and artillery fire. Therefore, in order to implement Donald Trump's plan, it is actually necessary to force the Russians to retreat from the current front line deeper into the occupied part of the Donetsk front. In other words, there needs to be an equal withdrawal of forces from the central line. Only then can it be called a demilitarized zone. But right now, for some reason, Trump isn't demanding that the unwashed Russians withdraw their troops, so it looks like an attempt to deceive Ukraine. Besides, we all remember the Minsk agreements, those agreements that were designed as roadmaps to lasting peace. But they never fulfilled their purpose, and importantly, they didn't provide Ukraine with security guarantees. And Putin used those 8 years precisely to prepare a foothold in the occupied territories for a new attack. That's exactly what Ukraine is afraid of right now. I'll leave it at that. Share your thoughts in the comments, subscribe, and hit the bell to catch all new episodes. Friends, if you found this episode interesting and you think my work is necessary and important, you can support this YouTube channel financially with any donation or paid subscription using the links and details provided. In the description of this video it says, "Support the channel Alexei Pechi." Choose any format that is convenient for you. Thank you for any support. That's all for now. Take care and goodbye.